Hello everyone, welcome back to Dr. Feist's series of videos on the Nicomachean Ethics. And in this video, I'm continuing to work and talk my way through Chapter 6 of Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. And this is Chapter 6, Section B. And in the previous video, we gave a little bit of an overview of what's happening. Here, in this video, what I want to do is talk a little bit, that is, give you a little background on Plato's theories of ideas, or forms. Now, we have to be careful about this term, forms, ideas, or whatnot, because it originally is a translation, and again, always be nervous and worried about translations, because when people make translations, they make choices. The Greek term is eidos, and this is not a psychological term in Greek, whereas a term like ideas in English has a psychological connotation. You have an idea, like something in you, something in some way is in your brain. You have it. You have an idea. It's a private sort of thing. You can share your ideas. That's getting a little closer to the notion of eidos, where we say, oh, well, we're going to share ideas. We have an idea in common. Okay, that's a little better. And also, you can even look at a more abstract version if we get together, we're trying to do something together, and we think about, okay, what's our idea? What are we trying to express here? That's even more objective. So, or if you say, what was the idea being expressed in a certain culture at a certain time? What's the idea of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, all these kinds of things? When we talk about ideas in that sense, we're getting closer to the way that Plato seems to have thought of these things. But even then, it's not clear how Plato exactly thought about what an eidos really was. There's all kinds of problems with it. So that's why some people prefer the term form, like a form. Like when you have a form that you pour something into, like in pottery. The form gives the mixture a shape. Oh, it's a certain shape after you pour it in. The form gives the shape, and you have a pot or a jug. Or it's the same thing, you have forms for cement. You pour the cement in and you get a block, a building block that you could do something with. Forms give a shape. They give not just simply a shape as in a geometrical shape, they give a shape also in terms of a function. So in the general approach to Plato's theories of ideas, or forms, or the notion of an eidos, an object like an object like a coffee cup. According to this, we should think of it as a combination. The technical term was hylomorphism, but I don't want to get really into that. It's a combination, namely, of a form, the eidos, and the matter. Now again, this is just a very rough introduction. It's a lot more subtle than this, but this will give you the idea so that we can understand what Aristotle's more or less going after. The coffee cup has a certain form, and we could call it, for lack of a better term, the cupness. And the cupness applies to the matter. It might be plastic or wood. In Plato's day, it certainly would have been plastic. It would have been probably some kind of metal. And this cupness, once it's put in, somehow put into the metal, it turns this basic metal thing into a coffee cup, and it can now have a function. And we've seen in our previous videos, go back and review this, that objects, people, all kinds of things can have functions. Knives can have functions. The function is to cut. A poor knife will cut poorly. A good knife will cut well. So you can have a function to a knife, a function to a coffee cup, and a coffee cup that you can drink from cleanly and easily. That would be a good coffee cup. That would be a coffee cup that is an excellent coffee cup, kind of like having the arete of the coffee cup is to be able to use it well. A coffee cup that whenever you drank from it, if it was hard to drink out of it or it didn't pour well, that would be something that's not discharging its function very well, and it wouldn't have this sort of arete. So remember, arete is a broader term than just the English term virtue, which has a moral connotation to it. Arete does have a moral connotation, but it's broader. So what we were trying to do when we understand the Greeks is to always remember that we tend to view things much more subjectively than they did. They had much more objective notions. For example, the notion of beauty, the form of beauty, the idea of the eidos of beauty. Plato would never accept that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's a subjective notion. As a matter of fact, Plato would have thought a statement like beauty's in the eye of the beholder as highly, highly anthropomorphic. You're taking something of the universe, beauty is a part of the world, and saying it's just dependent on how we think. No, he would reject all that. So Plato, Aristotle, they have much, much more objectivist positions than we often do. So what you want to do, again, is to break from associating the term eidos with ideas and forms in the sense of something psychological. It's actually something quite independent of us. Whether or not a coffee cup has a function is independent, really, of us. We can check to see if it discharges its function well, and we can come to agreements or disagreements on it, but whether or not it really does it isn't just something we just dream up. Okay, so in that sense, we've got things in the world have this combination. And so a knife, for instance, same thing. It would have some kind of metal, and then you would add knifeness to it. So other things as well. So a knife would have its eidos, right? So eidos in its knifeness, and then its matter would be metal. And again, this is just the real bare bones of it, just sort of the skeleton, if you like, of the whole theory of forms. Now, the reason why I say there's a lot of scholarly debate and as to what Plato exactly thought they were is these forms, that is because he talks about them in a variety of places, and in some places he doesn't talk about them at all, and in other places he launches fierce criticisms of them. Now, just as a notion of what's one criticism that we can immediately think of goes something like this. If I have two coffee cups or two knives, so if I have two knives, okay, knife 1 and knife 2. We have two of these. You have two knives. Well, in order to be knives, they would have to have something in common, namely this kind of knifeness. So they have a common eidos. So that's something that's objective. So they're somehow both related to this this eidos, right, of knifeness. All right. Okay, so far so good. They have different metal, but the same eidos. Okay, how does that work now? The two knives are in different places at the same time. So you've got the problem of something being at the same time in two different places. And eidos has to be able to do that. So what is this eidos and how does it relate to the knife? Well, in this sense, we have a notion of participation. So when you say the knife has metal or involves metal, right, because it has to, in order to be a knife, it would have to have some kind of metal probably in Plato's day, and we can have glass and other things today, but it would have to have some material. But the knife 1 has metal, knife 2 has metal, but it can't have the same metal, it has to be different. So the notion of the knife possessing metal and the notion of knife 1 possessing metal and knife 2 possessing metal seems to be different than the way knife 1 has the eidos of knifeness and knife 2 has the eidos of knifeness. Why? Because in one sense they're possessing different metal, and in one sense they're possessing the same eidos. So new term is needed to differentiate between these two ways of quote-unquote possessing. Possessing seems pretty easy in terms of metal, but it seems to be more difficult in terms of the eidos. So we now have another philosophical term, the notion of participation. So the two knives, they don't possess the eidos of knifeness in the way that they possess the matter of metal. they participate in the eidos of knifeness. So we now have to ask the question, what does that mean? Right? That's a very sort of odd kind of thing to say, well, it participates in. I, for example, participate in the certain form of human beingness, or however you want to put it. I'm participating in a form of that. This pen is participating in a certain form of penness, etc., etc. Whiteboardness, these two whiteboards are different whiteboards, but they participate in this whiteboardness eidos. What exactly is this participation? So that is a key problem. And if this eidos has to be in two places simultaneously, there's no physical object that seems to be able to do that, right? I mean, today in quantum mechanics, if you go off and study that, physicists will sometimes talk about things being in different places simultaneously or whatnot, but of course Plato wouldn't be aware of that in any way, and also that's also notoriously difficult to unpack as well. So I'm going to just put that to the side. But we are faced with the question of, how does something be instantiated in two different things in different places distinctly simultaneously? So in that sense, is the eidos something that's in another world? Where is this thing? And how do we relate to it? And it gets even worse. If we think about the fact, as I mentioned, there's different knives. Now let's look at these guys. Knife 1, knife 2, knife 3, ... going down to knife N, like multiple knives. There's millions of knives in the world. Okay. Each of these, then, will have their own participation relation, and we'll call this one N. So you've got knife 1 participates in relation 1 to knifeness. Knife 2 has relation 2, but again, it's a participation relation. So you can see there's all these participation relations, different ones. The problem is with the third man argument, I'm going to give you this one version of it because there's many different versions. But all of these, now, what makes them participation relations? Well, they all, in order to be participation relations, they have to participate in the form, in another form, according to this theory, of the general form of knifeness participation. Okay. So in other words, this participation relation 1 participates in this general form of participation. So does this one, so does this one, and so does this one. So now we've got the problem of knife 1 participating somehow in this participation, and we need yet another explanation of how it participates. So what you generate here is an infinite number of participation relations. So in order to explain, if we go back here, in order to explain how different things, right, like different knives can all be knives, and then you bring in this notion of an eidos, a form, you generate the question of what is a participation, and where is the eidos located? So there's a couple of problems right there. And then back over here, if you just accept, well, maybe participation is just a relationship we can't really understand. It's like a primitive, and that's fine. Science is loaded with primitives. Some things we just postulate as part of the world. But then you get this problem of each participation relation, in order to be that, has to itself participate in another kind of form, and you just keep adding forms and forms and forms and forms. And literally your, shall we say, your metaphysics just ramifies. It just explodes. There's forms after forms after forms, and you end up not really explaining anything, but you get an enormously complicated picture, and you're left wondering, this is worse than the original problem. So one of the things you want to be careful of in philosophy in general, and in life in general, is don't make your solution worse than the problem. So in this case now, we have this what's called the third man argument. This is one version of it. There's different ways you can formulate it. But the basic idea is that once you introduce all these forms and participation, they just seem to multiply. You just keep getting more and more of them. Now, to be fair to Plato, as I said, it's difficult to say exactly what Plato thought the forms were, what he thought an eidos was, whether he thought it really was otherworldly, what he really thought participation was. It's not clear. But nobody is more critical than Plato regarding the forms. So what we have is in some books of Plato, so yes, it's a puzzle overall, but if you look at some works of Plato, like the Republic, he uses forms. Doesn't really explain them all that well, but we have some kind of access to them. So the Republic has one view, the dialogue, the Republic, one view of forms, another dialogue, Theaetetus, which is actually even later than the Republic, we think, according to our dating techniques. This one, there's no forms. Doesn't mention them at all. So here we have forms, no forms. In the early dialogues, we don't really have forms at all. Then we go to no forms, and then in the Parmenides, you have some of the strongest criticisms that you'll ever find of the theory of forms, and those are by Plato as well. So, what exactly is Aristotle attacking here? Is he attacking a version of the forms that Plato himself ever believed? Or, and this is an important thing when you're reading and studying the history of philosophy, is it Plato's view? Right? Plato was the master. He ran the academy. He taught Aristotle. Is this Plato's view that Aristotle is attacking in book 6, or sorry, chapter 6 of book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, or is this the Platonists' view? Those could be more or less Plato's students. Is Aristotle really attacking what he thought Plato's students were saying, and maybe not necessarily Plato himself? So it's always important to keep in mind that when you read something that's called Platonism, it may not be something that Plato himself would have agreed with. So philosophers, especially great ones like Plato and Aristotle, they inspire more or less traditions, and the material that's in that tradition is not necessarily something that the quote-unquote originator of that tradition would have agreed with, or maybe even known about. Might have even rejected it. It's hard to say. So there's your little overview regarding Plato's theory of ideas. I just wanted to present a rough overview of it so that you have an idea of what Aristotle is going to go after in the rest of chapter 6. But before we get to that, the next video, what I'm going to get into is a little bit of logic of Aristotle's that you need in order to understand his critique of this picture of the theory of forms. Stay tuned.